Daniel French was exceptional at sculpting the human form. No one in history could sculpt the female body as well as French. He did not reveal the female models he used with one exception, and only one time, his daughter Margaret. She posed for a character from a Longfellow poem. Bill, a docent at Chesterwood Museum, says there is a bit of Mary, his wife, and Margaret, his daughter, in every allegorical female statue. Mary or Margaret could be the hands or feet, or they could strike a posed position. You may have noticed, Mary's maiden name was French. Mary was Daniel's first cousin. Therefore, besides Margaret being his daughter, she was his first cousin once removed. In Daniel's announcement of Margaret's marriage, he announced, "My first cousin once removed is betrothed to my future son-in-law." Mr. French had an intellectual sense of humor. You most often had to think about what he said. One of Daniel French's favorite models was Audrey Munson. By 1916, at 24 years old, she was arguably the most famous female celebrity in the world. Her career began in 1909 and was over in 12 years. For 3 years, 1914 through 1916, she was a super celebrity. She was truly the first supermodel. No one ever has enjoyed the status she had for an equal 3-year span. Since Daniel French did not reveal his primary model, you, the viewer, can decide for yourself if Audrey Munson is the Council Bluffs angel. While French was secretive, other artists were not. Also, Audrey and her mother Kitty would often be present at many of the dedications where she was the model. By 1914, she was more of the focus of the dedication than what was being dedicated. Here are close-ups of Audrey and the Council Bluffs angel. Are they the same lady? The clay work for the Council Bluffs angel was done when Audrey was 26 years old, and this publicity photo of Audrey, on the right, was taken when she was 24 years old. Consider the neck, cheekbones, lips, nose, eyes, and eyebrows. Is Audrey the angel? Miss Brooklyn and the Council Bluffs angel are both by Daniel French, with original clay work done about 3 years apart. Miss Brooklyn was done in light gray granite. The Council Bluffs angel was done in patina bronze. Audrey was also the photographer's dream. Look at the 3 chins, noses, and eyebrows. They are identical. Audrey must have been the Council Bluffs angel. At 16 years old, Audrey joined Gerald Hampton's Dancing Dolls, a touring company. This was a typical Follies of the day, with lots of girls wearing lavish but revealing costumes while singing and dancing. When the Dancing Dolls stopped in New York City, Audrey left the tour. She was spotted on Fifth Avenue shopping by photographer Felix Benedict Herzog. He convinced Audrey and her mother Kitty to do a photographic study of Audrey. Photographic study was sophisticated words for nude or nearly nude photography. The photographer showed his photographs of Audrey around. In some way, Isidore Conti became aware of Audrey. He hired her to pose for a freestanding sculpture that dominated the Astor Hotel lobby for years. Audrey was the muse for all of the 3 graces. Posing, at least at first, didn't pay enough, so Audrey continued to sing and dance. Here is chorus girl Audrey, in Girlies, at the New Amsterdam Theater in New York. In only 5 years, Audrey had gone from discovery to the most copied girl in America. She was the first supermodel, and the pinnacle was still to come in 1915 when she became the Expo Girl. Literally, 3/5 of all the statuary at the Panama Pacific Expo was Audrey. Before leaving the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, there are two noteworthy photographs. Here is a picture of that is believed to be Audrey and her mother Kitty at the exposition. Here is Audrey and Alan Lockhead with his Model G hydroplane. Alan and his brother Malcolm charged $10 a ride from a landing at the fair on the bay, then around Alcatraz Island and back. Over 600 people took the ride. We do not know if Audrey took the ride in San Francisco, but Alan flew Audrey to Catalina Island from probably Newport Beach for the shooting of 2 movies Audrey starred in. Audrey was probably the first movie star to be flown to a set location. Alan and his brother Malcolm later changed their last name from Lockhead to Lockheed, as in Lockheed Martin. A famous quote from Alan when asked what he did during the early days of aviation was, "I survived." Part 2 of The Secret of the Angel will take us to the evening of February 27, 1919, when Dr. Walter and Mrs. Julia Wilkins boarded a train from Pennsylvania Railroad Station in Midtown Manhattan to return to their home in Long Beach, New York. Julia left on an earlier train, but they joined at the Long Island station. We don't know exactly what they did that day in the city, but since it was near the end of the month, rental payment and renter changes was likely. Julia had considerable property holdings. The doctor, who once had been the physicians to the Broadway stars, was all but retired as a doctor, and was mostly assisting Julia as a property manager. He still maintained his doctor's office not far from Times Square and the theater district. They had a city home, that is where the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts is today. The two traveled to the city almost every day. Julia usually had housekeepers at both locations, but over the 1918-1919 winter they did not have a housekeeper in Long Beach, and Julia had recently fired the city housekeeper and hired a new one. To better understand how the Ruth and Dodge Memorial Fountain in Council Bluffs went from a beautiful concept that would have been of national prominence in 1916 to something of shame to be hidden in the 1920 dedication, we need to look at the background of the times. Just the surface details are not enough to appreciate the angel's secret. The World War and world pandemic constantly affected the activities of the day. By 1916 the country was in sorry shape for leadership that knew the horrors of massive war, of equivalent opponents. General Grenville M. Dodge, the last living general to command an Union army in the Civil War, died January 3 of that year. General Peter Osterhaus, who had commanded the Union's 15th Corps in parts of 1864 and 65, was an American citizen that was very quietly living in Duisburg, Germany. He would die January 2, 1917. In 1898, Americans' globalism, promoted strongly by the press during the Spanish-American War, and continued by Congress in the Filipino-American War, was the craving of the elite leaders both in and out of government. The United States has never returned or released the imperialistic war prize of Spanish-speaking Puerto Rico. Next, President Theodore Roosevelt sent the Great White Fleet around the world in 1907 and 1908 to show the might of the United States. The Great War, now known as World War I, began July 28, 1914. It was a war about having a war. 6 empires were vying for prominence. 3 of the warring empires were headed by cousins. Notice the headlines back on August 1, 1914. France was invading Germany and England would soon declare war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson's position in the 1916 election was, "We will stay out of the war unless attacked." With this statement, his campaign slogan of, "A vote for Hughes is a vote for war, and with God," according to Wilson, backing his campaign of peace in America, he carried the critical Midwest states and he won. Hughes was the Republican candidate and Wilson was the Democratic incumbent. On January 18, 1917, the U.S. intercepted a coded telegram from Germany to Mexico, and it in essence read, "If the United States attacked Germany, would Mexico ally with Germany?" Also stated at the time via a different channel was that Germany would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Although England was blockading Germany from the surface of the sea, somehow Germany was viewed as evil and cowardly if they did the same from under the sea. President Wilson framed the telegram as an act of war and elevated it to a way of life-threatening crisis with his colleagues and the press. The U.S. was never attacked first by Germany, and in deference to his promise and thousands of campaign buttons proclaiming peace in America supported by God and branding his opponent as a warmonger, the second-term Democrat president persuaded Congress to declare war on Germany only 33 days after his inauguration. With United States entry, most of the world was at war. Only the light green on this map shows countries attempting to stay neutral. United States sent 2,800,000 people overseas. 53,402 were killed in action, 63,114 died from disease and other causes, and about 250,000 were seriously wounded. The monetary cost was enormous at $32 billion in 1917 money. It was a war we did not have to fight. We were never attacked first. On the last day of the war, the commanding field generals on both sides, at 5:10 a.m., November 11, 1918, declared an armistice starting at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. At 6 a.m. the Allied troops commenced a great attack. At least 320 Americans were killed and more than 3,240 were seriously wounded before 11 a.m., all for nothing. Worldwide, the war about having a war killed 20 million people, again for nothing. The Treaty of Versailles, which was the culmination of 5 other treaties, was signed on June 28, 1919. The League of Nations was officially formed January 10, 1920. Both the treaty and the League had lofty taglines of liberty, peace, and fairness. The people of the appropriate elevation and qualified to be sent by their countries were the most greedy, ruthless, and conniving diplomats their countries had. This was the chance to chop up the world and get a big piece. 20 years and 64 days after signing the treaty to end all wars, World War II began. The United States did not join the Wilson-founded and endorsed League of Nations. The biggest independent news media of the time, that of William Randolph Hearst, was not buying into round 2 of Wilson's manipulations. Hearst was critical of most of the things Wilson was doing. When asked why he, Hearst, strongly supported the Spanish-American War but not the Great War, his reply was that Spain or any other world powers should stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and we should stay out their territories too. If there is an oracle type of think tank somewhere, some good questions would be, if the United States had not entered the Great War, would the warring countries exhausted themselves, stop fighting and get smart cleaning up their own mess? Would there have been another world war? Would Hitler have come to power and killed 6 million Jews? Maybe the prestige of the U.S. president being the leader of the free world is too costly for us and others. Haskell County, Kansas was ground zero in January 1918 when the Spanish flu virus jumped from swine to people. It was called the Spanish flu because the Spanish press wrote about it first. Spain was not a participant in World War I and the press was not embargoed in revealing the nation's capabilities. Most likely from Haskell County it went to Dodge City next, then via the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad, to Junction City, Kansas, then on to Fort Riley and first infecting Camp Funston. Camp Funston trained 50,000 troops for the Great War. By March of 1918 the flu was recognized as a major killer, but that was too late. The famed 89th Infantry Division, made primarily of Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota men, were on their way to France to fight at the Battle of St. Mihiel and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. From Camp Funston, shown here, the flu spread worldwide, the soldiers deployed. The flu hit the virulent 20 to 40 age group the hardest due to a cytokine storm. That is, an overreacting immune system. The older people with less active immune system fared better. Those seniors that had survived the Russian flu of 1889 and 1890 were almost immune. The pandemic was composed of 3 definable waves. The first wave in the dark brown was where the soldiers were stationed and fighting. The second wave was an area adjacent to the first. And the third wave was anywhere else where there was enough population to keep it spreading, resulting in death. And more death. 50 million deaths were estimated worldwide. That was approximately 3.3% of the world's population. At the end of Part 1 of The Secret of the Angel video series, Daniel French and Henry Bacon had been at Council Bluffs. Only Ann Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey would pay for the memorial. The location had been decided upon and a tabletop model of the memorial had been approved by the 2 Dodge girls. By the evening of February 27, when this part ends, Audrey Munson and Daniel French had gotten together for clay sculpting in the summer of 1917. It would take 3 more steps to produce a bronze angel. The stonework from Stony Creek Quarry, in Connecticut was finished, shipped to Council Bluffs and placed on the site, and the water was piped to the bowl that the angel is holding. The memorial was finished by October of 1918, and a great celebration would be planned for Decoration Day, 1919. Ruth Ann Dodge, the wife of nationally known General Grenville M. Dodge, would also be remembered. The 2 Dodge girls had spared no expense. They had the same architect-sculptor team that was doing the Lincoln Memorial. The stone was from the very same quarry the Statue of Liberty stood on. The balance of Part 2 will follow the Dodge girls, Daniel French and Audrey Munson, as this narrative moves forward to February 27, 1919. Late in 1915, after the Panama Pacific Exposition closed, and for the first half of 1916, Audrey and Kitty lived in Santa Barbara, California. There, Audrey shot Purity and Girl of Dreams for American Film Manufacturing Company, more commonly known as the Flying A Studio. For the Flying A, Audrey was a major star. Instead of the 2 and 3 reel cowboy movies, Audrey's Purity was a 5 or 6 reel movie. Hopefully someday we will be able to see Purity again. 1 copy is known to have survived. It is presently being restored by Le Centre National du Cinéma, commonly known as CNC. The CNC is an autonomous bureau under the Ministry of Culture in France. Late summer 1916, Audrey and Kitty moved back to New York State. She stopped first in Syracuse and then to Rochester. Audrey hoped to develop her vocal talent to complement her piano skills. Her movie, Purity, was a box office hit across the nation where it wasn't banned for nudity. From what is known of Purity, Audrey had appeared nude as often as she was clothed. A good assumption is that Audrey was tired of being the world's foremost en naturel muse. If Audrey had been under contract with Flying A, it was now over. Audrey left after the William Randolph Hearst financial takeover. The one-time payment money for acting in Purity soon ran out. Whatever compensation she had negotiated based upon the release of Girl O' Dreams was worthless. It wasn't being released and never would be. Audrey needed to get back to New York City where she could earn money. She moved to a stylish neighborhood near the old Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan. Technically that was Polo Grounds Roman numeral 4, shown here on this New York map. For reference, here is Central Park, the United Nations today, the Empire State Building, and where the World Trade Towers were. Even though Audrey was probably the world's most famous celebrity, jobs were scarce in New York. Unless you were Harry Houdini and could make elephants disappear. If she wanted to be a major movie actress, she had to work in Southern California. There was an overabundance of stage actresses in New York as the movies took customers from the stage. Modeling for the sculptors and painters had changed too. Photography was overtaking painting, and although there were jobs as a photo model, the shooting lasted less than an hour and barely paid for trolley fare to get to the locations. Worse for Audrey was sculpture. The 2,400-year reign of classic sculpture had come to an end at the closing of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. It was as if the sculptors had realized that they could not compete with the masters of the previous 2 millenniums and therefore started to experiment with Cubism, Futurism, Dada, and other forms of modern art. Note: Venus de Milo above was made of marble and has lasted 2,000 years, unfortunately with damage. Torchbearer was made of staff, a type of superplaster of Paris, that lasted until the Panama Pacific Exposition closed and most of the classical sculpting closed. Torchbearer, with Audrey Munson as the model, was sculpted by Sherry Edmondson Fry of Creston, Iowa. We saw his work before using Miss Munson on top of the Missouri State Capitol building. Mr. Fry was Mr. Camouflage for the United States Army in World War I. He had learned concealment hunting deer in south-central Iowa. Fortunately for Audrey, the Gibson Girl, an identifiable America evolution of the Edwardian fashion, had produced window shoppers on 5th and 6th Avenue in New York in the first decade of the 1900s. By 1917, the shoppers were pros as department stores boomed. The Gilded Age of department stores had begun. Audrey began working as a beauty consultant in the stores. She may have been the first celebrity to endorse beauty products. Classic sculpture was not completely dead. Daniel C. French and his only female protégée, Evelyn Beatrice Longman, were still being commissioned to sculpt allegorical memorials to honor past heroes and loved ones. Neither artist revealed the primary model or models, and usually the memorial type of sculpture required minimal nudity, if any. Minimal nudity is what Audrey wanted as she entered her next stage of life with hopeful matrimony at the end. In 1917, Audrey began a romance with the most eligible bachelor in the country, Herman Ulrichs Jr. Herman was literally the Comstock load of bachelors. He was the grandson of Lucky Jim Fair, the most successful of the Nevada silver miners. Lucky Jim was not only lucky but also a shrewd businessman. With the money from his silver and gold mines, he was the primary investor in the Southern Pacific Railroad and a United States Senator from California. He had 4 children, and by the time of his death only the 2 daughters survived. Lucky Jim Fair passed on his massive estate to his 2 daughters, Teresa on the left and Virginia on the right, or more commonly known as Tessie and Bertie if one was in the extreme wealthy class. Both got $50 million in 1895. Tessie, who often dressed in white, was born in a shack in a Nevada mining camp in 1871. Bertie, who often dressed in black and was born 4 years later in San Francisco, after Lucky Jim struck it rich. Together they completed one of Jim Fair's dreams. That being the most grand and luxurious hotel in the western United States. The girls named it Fairmont. Fair was their last name and Mont, M-O-N-T, was French for mountain. Nob Hill in San Francisco is not a mountain but close enough, and the name worked for the girls. The grand opening of the hotel was scheduled for mid-morning on April 18, 1906, at the appropriate time for a lavish lunch spread. But at 5:12 a.m. a massive earthquake hit. It lasted nearly 60 seconds. It ruptured 296 miles of the San Andreas Fault at 7.9 moment magnitude. San Francisco was the epicenter. Tessie and her husband, Herman Ulrichs Sr., put the money to work and also built Rose Cliff at the cost of $2.5 million in 1902 money. Herman Sr. was American-born and Yale-educated but had European royalty in the family tree. His firm, Ulrichs & Company, was the capable U.S. agent of the Norddeutsche Lloyd, the shipping giant. Tessie and Herman bought the original Rose Cliff and tore it down and built the Rose Cliff shown here. It was designed after King Louis XV's Grand Trianon in the domain of Versailles in France. Tessie was one of the 4 queens of the triumvirate of 400. Each queen had a mansion that could accommodate the social club of the most well-to-do, of society's 400. The other queens at different times during their reigns were Caroline Astor, Mamie Fish, and Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. While Tessie probably did not mind Junior sowing wild oats with Audrey Munson, after all she was the foremost celebrity in the country, if not the world, but she wasn't going to let him marry a woman that worked for a living, let alone who took off her clothes. What would the 400 think? Tessie had been born in a rooming house shack in a Nevada mining camp, but she was royalty now and she intended to stay that way. Audrey's romance with Herman took place in 1917 and 1918. The cost to be fashionable enough to be seen with Herman would have been an enormous drain on Audrey's savings and her earning capabilities. By late 1918, Audrey was living in a small 2-room apartment owned by Mrs. Julia Wilkins. The apartment was ideally located between Upper Broadway and Central Park West on 67th Street. Julia Wilkins' husband, Dr. Walter Wilkins, a retired physician, managed the property. Socially, New York City was all but shut down. Most people were wearing masks because of the Spanish flu. Business efforts were serious and directed toward victory in the Great War in Europe. Audrey had posed before the Spanish flu pandemic for Daniel French and Evelyn Longman for statues somewhere in Georgia, Michigan, and Iowa, but that was done. Audrey needed work as winter approached. Audrey and Kitty left New York City hoping for work in Toronto, Canada, where maybe she would be new to the artist, entertainment proprietors, and the department stores. Kitty and Audrey stopped in Rochester on the way north, and Audrey visited with her father. Ironically, Herman Jr. did marry an actress in 1925. Her name was Dorothy Hadel. She had non-starring roles in 3 movies in 1916 and 1917. Herman's mother, Tessie, may have objected, but she was fighting and losing the battle against what today would probably been diagnosed as Cushing syndrome. Cushing is an extreme abnormal weight gain of fatty tissue. Herman inherited Rose Cliff when his mother died in 1926, but Herman wasn't Lucky Jim, his grandfather, nor his mother Tessie or his father. Rose Cliff had cost $2.5 million in 1900 to 1902 to build. Herman sold the Rose Cliff mansion in February of 1941. 4 months later, the new owner, hoping to flip his acquisition for profit, sold it at auction for $21,000. The furniture, art, and anything not built into the mansion sold for an additional $77,000. That was a mere $98,000 total. Tessie, in her queen days, would spend that much on a quaint party. After Herman's death in 1948, Dorothy, or Dumps as her family in St. Louis called her, married Prince Ferdinand of Liechtenstein. Daniel French had 2 homes and 2 studios. The transitions from the city to his summer home in Stockbridge, Massachusetts happened on May 15 and back to the city on November 1. Audrey Munson is believed to have traveled from New York City to Stockbridge in late May of 1917 to pose for the Council Bluffs Angel and maybe for other projects. This is nearly a repeat of what Hetty Anderson did 4 years earlier for the Spencer Trask The Spirit of Life Memorial. French invited Anne Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey to see the clay angel in June of 1917. Anne was summering in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, just 15 miles north of Stockbridge. Here is Daniel French putting the finishing touches on the Spencer Trask Spirit of Life Memorial. The angel is on a rotating platform that is on rail tracks that can be pushed outdoors through a huge door. 4 years later, the Council Bluffs Angel would have been in the same place. The finished Spirit of Life Angel and the Council Bluffs Angel are patina bronze. The angel you see here is in the plaster stage. Anne Dodge and Ella Dodge Pusey saw the clay angel in the summer of 1917. Anne would not see the plaster stage angel until the fall at his New York City studio in Greenwich Village. Besides the clay angel, Anne and Ella saw a rough model of the boat's bow. In late August, Anne saw a clay wreath and a finished boat bow that came from the Norcross Brothers Company, headquartered in Worcester, Massachusetts. The finished stonework came from Stony Creek Quarry of Branford, Connecticut. In August, the mold of the clay angel was made. The mold was removed from the clay, probably sectioned into at least 10 pieces. The mold pieces was sent to French's New York studio. In New York City, the mold pieces were reassembled to form castable units. Here is a picture of the unfinished plaster angel. The head and each wing are units and can be seen by unfinished joints. The head is barely on the body. At some time Daniel French went to the New York studio ahead of the usual November 1st transition from Stockbridge and finished the plaster angel. Anne saw the finished plaster angel in late September, 1917, at French's New York City studio and was thrilled. Prepping, making the bronze cast, and casting the angel took until March 1918. The bronze angel is made of approximately 88% copper and the balance is tin. Copper was in extreme short supply due to the war and the need for brass shells, of which copper is 66%. The patina bronze angel was shipped to Council Bluffs in April of 1918. The stonework arrived in Council Bluffs in the fall of 1917. Even though the site of the Ruth and Dodge Memorial Fountain is considered adjacent to Fairview Cemetery, some board members of the cemetery criticized the color of the stone. Presumably it was too flamboyantly different from the white, the many shades of gray, and a few tan headstones and monuments in Fairview proper. In a letter to Anne Dodge, Daniel French reassured her the problem would pass. Another problem was getting water to the angel. The city wanted to charge Anne and Ella $8,000. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $160,000 in the year 2023 money. The supposed high cost was due to shortage of copper, because of the war. The copper water pipe would go from the street to the memorial. When Frank Pusey, Ella's husband, returned to Council Bluffs in 1918, and probably with the help of Emmett Tinley, the longtime Dodge family lawyer, they probably convinced the city they could use galvanized steel water pipe, and that some of it was already done. There had been a house removed that overlapped with the memorial site that had had water 10 years prior. Frank and Emmett also had to fight limitation on seasonal use of water and hours during the day. Ella, in frustration, wrote a scathing note that pointed out that her dad, the general, had given a third of his fortune to the city, had sponsored the reading room at the public library, and sponsored veterans' care and relief work. Not included in the note, but well aware in public knowledge, was that the general had sponsored a full-featured YMCA building. On the far lower right was the separate entrance to the Grand Army of the Republic Hall. Also, General Dodge somehow encouraged Andrew Carnegie to oversize the public library with some extra Dodge money. This was the largest and most expensive Carnegie Grant library in the state of Iowa. Late summer, Anne checked herself into a sanitarium near Whitehall, West Virginia, due to a nervous breakdown over problems relating to the memorial. The Spanish flu was the 1918 summer monster, and maybe Anne wanted to be away from New York City. By October 1918, the memorial was finished. Frank Pusey, Ella's husband, formally closed the contract with Daniel French in November. In Pusey's final correspondence of 1918 with French, he requested French's attendance at the dedication next spring. Even though the contract was closed, Daniel French assisted in problems in 1920 due to ground settling and a broken water pipe. As the 1919 spring approached, it was time for Ella and Anne to plan the dedication. The Spanish flu deaths were steadily declining. By March of 1919, optimistic headlines like this was showing up in newspapers across the country. Anne and Ella were ready to have a Decoration Day memorial to their mother that few would forget. In February of 1919, Anne Dodge and Daniel French resumed correspondence. We don't know what Anne said to Daniel French, but we can surmise a lot by reading Daniel French's response. In February, Anne most likely complimented French on the memorial now that it was finished, and especially the angel. In response on February 25, Daniel French relates the value of the Council Bluffs angel to his statue, Memory. Memory is a priceless work of art in the American sector of the New York Metropolitan Art Museum. Memory was done in fine white marble and exists in a perfectly climate-controlled indoor safe setting. The Council Bluffs angel is patina bronze and exists outdoor in a climate of extremes, and with a variety of birds, squirrels, and other visitors. Anne Dodge wrote a letter probably on the fateful Thursday, February 27, to Daniel French asking him to come to the dedication and how should she do it. On Monday, March 3, French received the letter and replied that he would come if possible, and made suggestions to Anne about the order of exercise in dedication such a monument. For Anne and Ella, this was to be a grand dedication. Anne is believed to still have access to General Dodge's private rail car. The trip from New York or Washington, D.C. would have been pleasurable for any guest. The author of this video and a former director of the historic General Dodge House in Council Bluffs, believe that Ruth Ann Dodge knew at least 7 First Ladies. Both Edith Roosevelt and Nellie Taft were still quite active. Edith had laid her husband T.R. to rest in January, but she was a traveler. Nellie and William Howard Taft had many connection to the Dodges and also with Daniel French. The Dodges were Iowa's most notable family, and the general had been known in railroad circles in most of the developed world. 2 of the general's past business associates, Andrew Mellon and Andrew Carnegie, were still alive. The Dodge name was still in the headlines as the projects the general was involved with were being completed. In 1913, Iowa's Governor George W. Clark asked General Dodge, who was 82 years old, to initiate and to consult on cleaning up the blighted neighborhoods around the Capitol building. In Iowa, the land of hogs and sows, the neighborhood around the Capitol was a pigsty. It was a national embarrassment. Traditionally, the city of Des Moines cared little about the area around the Capitol building. To the city, that was the state's problem. Starting first with Governor Cummins and then Governor Clark, both who were residents of the city of Des Moines and governors of the state. They both wanted the embarrassment gone, and the greatest public transportation engineer ever, General Grenville M. Dodge, was only 120 miles away and could travel back and forth in his private railroad car and on the railroad right away he had laid out 60 years prior. The general, although suffering from ailments, was willing to help. By the way, the general tried his hand at watercolors and painted his car. Here is a map of the Capitol building area. The green outlined area was where the state of Iowa had property as of 1913. The red outlined area was General Dodge's proposed Capitol extension. The blue rectangles were churches and schools. The churches and schools were given options under the extension, while all other property would be acquired under eminent domain. The extension requiring a special taxation and acquiring land from the city of Des Moines. The city went to the Iowa Supreme Court. Even with the Supreme Court's favorable ruling for the state, it was still hotly contested in editorials and front pages of newspapers across the state. Here is one article from the Cedar Rapids Republican that favored the extension and qualifies the project with the general's name and words. 70 acres were acquired, adding that to the existing 13 acres for a total of 83 acres. That was slightly more than the combined total of 17 other states, including New York with 9.5 acres and Illinois with a whopping 10 acres. Iowa went from what was probably the worst Capitol grounds in the nation to the best. The expansion also included the Senator William Boyd Allison Memorial, by sculptor Evelyn Beatrice Longman, architect Henry Bacon, and featuring 4 statues modeled by Audrey Munson. One of the most ambitious projects, when the general was the president of the Society of the Army of the Tennessee, was the Ulysses S. Grant Memorial in Union Square. General Dodge masterminded and lobbied the Hepburn Act through Congress that resulted in one of the 5 most recognizable icons of Washington, D.C. Few know who initiated the project, and unfortunately General Dodge never saw it completed. A few of the old-timers may have remembered the young Dodge family and the general building the Iowa School for the Deaf. Governor Samuel Merrill, who was a Union general during the Civil War and severely wounded in the Vicksburg campaign at the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, asked General Dodge after completion of the Transcontinental Railroad to build a school on an 80-acre tract south of Council Bluffs. Ruth Ann also had family in nearby Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, and in Texas. Once any of the Super A-list committed, there would be thousands, just like at the general's funeral, 3 years before in the dead of winter. That is what Anne and Ella had paid for and intensely wanted. It was now Mom's turn. This takes us almost to the end of The Secret of the Angel Part 2. To recap, the war was concluded, the Spanish flu pandemic was nearly over, Henry Bacon was spending much of his time in Washington, D.C. supervising the Lincoln Memorial Building, Daniel French was in New York making trips to the Piccadilly Brothers, watching Abraham Lincoln being carved. Audrey Munson and Kitty were in Toronto finding work. Ella was in Council Bluffs and Anne was in Ventnor, New Jersey. Both were preparing for the dedication of the Ruth Ann Dodge Memorial Fountain. On February 27, 1919, Julia Wilkins joined Dr. Wilkins at the Long Island City Station on the Long Beach train, scheduled to arrive in Long Beach, New York at 9:15 p.m. The couple were dressed in late Victorian style of the 1890s. Both wore heavy wool coats and hats. The doctor had his customary bowler hat and Julia's coat was undoubtedly accented with furs. Julia carried a handbag, the doctor had an umbrella that he used as a cane. He also had an alligator satchel containing a good-sized Spanish mackerel, 1.5 pounds of shrimp, breakfast rolls and sweet treats for their 2 collie dogs. They weren't Catholic but Fish Friday was still practiced and the seafood would be dinner tomorrow. If the doctor went to the city on Friday, he would probably go by himself. The Weather Bureau was predicting snow on Friday. As it turned out, it was only 1.4 inches, but it was the heaviest of that dry winter. They may go to the city Saturday and stay overnight in their city home and attend Sunday morning services a block and a half away, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. Holy Trinity was not huge but was lovely inside and out, and faced Central Park at the 65th Cross Street, giving it the most beautiful church setting in the city. Their elderly next-door neighbor, the Earholes, could stop by to let Julia's 2 collies out and feed them as well as feed Julia's monkey and parrot. Mr. Earhole could stoke the furnace and keep the furnace burning. The temperature in Long Beach was staying in the 30s and 40s. From Pennsylvania Station to Long Beach, the system was electrified at 750 volts DC and was operated by the Long Island Railroad. After leaving Pennsylvania Station, it goes under the East River and comes up at Long Island City, a quick stop at Woodside, then onto the Big Jamaica Station. Julia and Walter started a conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Boyd. Mr. Boyd was the train's conductor. Next came Lynbrook, then Hempstead, where Mrs. Boyd got off to go home. Conductor Boyd stayed aboard to finish his shift. Since there were few passengers on the train and no passengers to pick up, the trip to Long Beach arrived 9 minutes early at 9:06 p.m. according to Conductor Boyd, who had to document the train's travel and who would have had a railroad-grade pocket watch. Before the 1920s, the railroads were the masters of time.